Hi and welcome to the Lousy Preachers podcast. Today, Pierre and I are again discussing the Heidelberg Catechism. Not the Heidelberg Disputation by Martin Luther. We are not Reformed. We are going to be
Not
discussing
anymore.
the latter half of the theses of his disputation, because last week we talked about how your works are meaningless in terms of getting your righteousness, basically. And trying to get to heaven by doing good things is not the way that it works in our Christian faith. And Pierre is going to explain exactly to us how and why. Over to you.
Thank you, Tristan. But before that, I think a Prost is in order. Prost.
Prost.
We've got each a very good coffee that's accompanying us through this presentation. Okay, so now let me just find the right button here. Okay, so the theology of the cross. Yeah, we did last time, I think, end around thesis number 3 and skipped, as you've just helpfully summarized here, those that drive the point home that our good works are, if we don't fear that they won't get us to heaven, they are still mortal sins. And then we get to thesis number 18, which provides us with something of a turning point in the Heidelberg Disputation. Now, thesis 18 reads, "It is certain that man must utterly despair of his own ability before he is prepared to receive the grace of Christ." And then in thesis 19 and 20, you have then this heart of the Heidelberg Disputation, which provides us with a neat little summary of what is the theology of glory and what is the theology of the cross. And we can contrast these two with one another by means of this little illustration here. Are you going to be relying on your glory, or are you going to be relying on the cross when it comes to your standing before God? So the theology of the glory has a pretty clear answer to this question. It directs us to our works, not exclusively. I mean, you could walk into any Catholic cathedral, and in the midst of all of the beautiful saints and angels and stained glass, which shows people working and doing good works, in the midst of all of that, still there is centrally Christ and his merits. But at the end of the day, the theology of the glory still does point us to ourselves. We have to aid somehow in our salvation. We have to contribute something to this, as though we could. And so then, directing us to our own works, it brings us ultimately to the destination of despair. If we engage honestly with, I think, the testimony of Holy Scripture, which confronts us in very vocal and clear terms with the fact that you cannot earn a right standing before God. You cannot make yourself, being essentially unacceptable in some way, shape, or form, good enough to deserve God's grace, God's mercy. It really somehow just misses the point. And falling into that spiral of constantly trying to be good enough, constantly trying to, as we mentioned in the last episode, establish some sort of a balance and equilibrium between our bad deeds and our good deeds, trying to climb Jacob's ladder and getting into heaven. I think for the honest journeyer brings you by a short or by a long route to a place of despair or dishonesty. But that's quite a hard statement. I think many of our Catholic brothers and sisters would protest at this point. I hope to hear from you in the comments. And this then is contrasted with the theology of the cross, which very much takes off from that point of despair and then directs us not at our own works, but at Christ's work on the cross, which then entices a reaction from our side, knowing full well we can't lean back on our own goodness. We can't lean back on our own efforts. It drives us to despair. And now we look at Christ And we have to react by clinging to him and clinging to what he has done on our behalf there on the cross. And then, by means of a short route, one arrives at the theology of the cross. And these two can then be brought into, well, relation to one another by means of this little horizontal arrow at the bottom, which Lutherans have been fond to call the Anfechtungen. That bridge between despairing in ourselves so utterly that we have no recourse but to cling to Christ for dear life. And Tristan, at that point, perhaps over to you. This is now, sorry, just before jumping over to you, this is to put into a concrete or a condensed summary how it happened in Luther's own life, where he found himself going through periods of intense despair and then coming to this realization that it is to Christ alone that he can cling. But yeah, Tristan, perhaps fast forwarding 500 years, how is it for us today?
Yeah, for us today, I mean, we may call this German word Anfechtungen afflictions in German, but it's not always actually the best translation. It's difficult to translate the word because Anfechtungen means basically you're being threatened, you're being almost surrounded by your enemy, you're being tempted. There's a lot of meaning attached to this one word. But to put it maybe, yes, in that one term as well, being in utter despair and just seeing an abyss in front of you, that's maybe a good way to describe it. Because when we do think of all the chaos that we are in and the problems that we have around us, everyone usually has some kind of problem that they're dealing with. Then it's difficult to focus on one thing, at least for me often. But yeah, it's definitely this chaos and this so many things happening around you, and you having to look at your own failings and your own sins, that might drive us today to also realize that, oh, bugger, sometimes I get myself into so much nonsense.
Yeah, I wanted to use a different word there.
Yeah, I do so much nonsense to myself and to others, and I don't know where I can find some kind of thing to hold on to for dear life.
Yes, yes. Amen. And I think that would then entail also that, well, that would amount to the link between that old guilt-ridden monk wrestling with his inability to firstly be sorry enough for the sins that he had made himself guilty of, and then for the inability of his good works to be truly good or to be good enough. Always still being infected by sin and not being, if one looks hard and long at it, something that you can pride yourself on. His situation, I think, is very much the situation of if we just pause for a moment and look honestly at ourselves in the mirror, it's our situation as well. It's not 500 years removed from us. It's visible every morning after you've brushed your teeth, and look at the look at those terrible two eyes staring back at you sometimes. So yeah, Anfechtungen, good. So that's what we call this little point of transfer or transitioning from despair to Christ. And I think it would be helpful for us at this stage to quickly look at the text of thesis 18, 19, and 20. We've already mentioned 18 now. It is certain that man must utterly despair of his own abilities before he is prepared to receive the grace of Christ. I think we understand that. We've gone through it now. As long as the illusion remains with you that you can lean on your own works, then a great disappointment is waiting to happen. But then thesis 19 and 20. Here we have now in thesis 19, the theology of glory summed up. That person does not deserve to be called a theologian who looks upon the invisible things of God as though they were clearly perceptible in those things which have actually happened. I want to ask you if you want to elaborate on this, but I just quickly want to throw in then the note of the historical context of this again. In the medieval system, very much so, in up until today, the Catholics have a very, I would be tempted to say, good relation between faith and reason. And in the medieval context, obviously, the philosophy, the moral philosophy also of Aristotle, had an immensely big role to play in Christian doctrine and in the doctrine of salvation. So, according to this, and Luther uses Romans 1 as a reference point here. I don't know. Do you have the quote perhaps offhand to refer to?
Not yet. I can get
Okay.
it quickly.
Right. Whilst you search for it, in the medieval period, the place of the theologian would be to somehow bring harmony between moral philosophy and revelation. So you have this elaborate system by means of virtues and vices, virtues which you should train yourself into become a good enough person, vices which you should keep away from far enough so that you do not become a condemnable person. And this process of, one could perhaps say, natural theology tries, by means of an elaborate system, a glorious system, you could even say, to give us a blueprint for becoming good enough for God. And I think here in Thesis 19, Luther says that if that to you is the heart of theology, you do not deserve to be called a theologian. But perhaps over to you as to why is this the case? Why does Luther say this? Like, what's the basis for it?
Well, maybe let me just first read the quote quickly.
Yes.
I got it. For I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. And then verse 17, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed through faith, for faith, as it is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the right one, right?
Yes. No, I think that definitely does that does cover it. If I'm not mistaken, would you read verse 20 as well? Sorry, I've just got the notes here.
Oh, yes. Okay. Well, just by the way, the big turning point for Luther was, of course, that he interpreted the word righteousness differently here.
Mm-hmm.
That is the righteousness of God and not our righteousness. Let me just
I would
get
love you
this.
to please expand upon that, because I think
Uh-huh.
there's necessity to expand upon that.
Yeah, I've got it. Ever since the creation of the world, God's eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been seen and understood through the things God has made. So they are without excuse. No, I don't have the next part.
Yeah, but I think actually
Yeah.
that's a good point. But they are without excuse who have not yet heard the gospel, who have not received God's law, because precisely this, as the ancient Greeks tried to advance it, that by means of natural reason, you can pursue virtue and become a good person. The Catholics try to hold on. Catholics of the Middle Ages, against whom Luther is protesting here, try to hold on to that and then bring it in some way, shape, or form into harmony with the gospel and say that Christ helps you just a little bit more to become a really good person. So you've got you've got the theological virtues, and then you also have I think they call them the classical virtues. And by means of growing in all of this virtue, you will become a good enough person. To which Luther says, "No, no, 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 no." Because of
And
that,
maybe on this point,
yeah,
I can just say we can think today of how we often say, I want to be a better version of myself, or I feel like I'm the best me when I'm with a certain person. But it's kind of like this other thing or person is there to make you better and to make you reach that one ideal. And I think what Luther is trying to say here is as well is if your ideal is to be a morally good person through Christ, then yes, that's good. But I think there's something even greater there that Christ can give us, or that we have through Christ, which I think you can say.
Well, actually, I want to throw the ball right back at you, because I might just drop the word, but then I'm going to say, please expand, because I think that the answer to that is yes, we do have something ultimately greater, and that is righteousness, the righteousness
Exactly.
of Christ. But there's
Yes.
quite a big difference between the righteousness of Christ and, you know, my own conceived ideas of righteousness. As you said, Luther's here
Yeah.
interpreting it as the righteousness of God, and yeah, not my imagined being good enough, if you'd like to
Yeah.
expand.
So obviously, instead of a grand and big plan, or our motivational speakers and motivational messages and our philosophies and our scientific discoveries that maybe tell us, wow, this is the way to an unending life or an infinite life. In spite of that, I would say a theologian of the cross would nowadays say, well, even then, still Christ is the only way to eternal life and the only way we can be saved. And that is a gift of righteousness to us. That's how I understand it.
You use such excellent words, because they allow us to flow so naturally through this. First, I want to stop at that word that you've just used now, grace. And I think this is also something, well, obviously one can look at the word etymologically, just look at how it's constructed and where it comes from, and that gives you kind of a clue. But grace is from the Latin gratis, which means gift. And a gift is by definition not something that you can, you know, earn, or that you can by means of your troubles get. It is something freely given, on the initiative of another. It's not something that you deserve. You deserve a salary. You deserve a loan. I don't know if that's the real English. But you do not deserve a
It's fine,
gift.
yeah.
A gift is freely given. And
Mhm.
as you've just mentioned, that when it comes to our salvation, that is a matter of grace. It is not a matter
Exactly.
of deserving. Yeah, because as we ended the last podcast, you deserve nothing but hell.
Yeah. Yeah, and
Um,
if you think about it, what we do when we think or say we can be better persons, and then, you know, show God how righteous we have become because of Him or something like that. If we think that that is that is the ultimate goal, then we're looking at this gift of God and saying, you know,
no,
God, I don't
thank
really
you.
need this.
Hmm.
I can do it on my own.
And we're lying to ourselves. Partly, I think, through ignorance, and partly through willful ignorance. Because on the one hand, and we might be able to stop for a brief while on this point, but I think, well, we could expand on the topic of sin generally, though there is a
Mhm.
very accomplished theologian, whom we both know, who's actually brought out
Yes.
a 5-minute long video on the topic, which is excellent. Perhaps we can drop a link to it in the description. But the effects of sin, the effects of our own sins, I mean, much of it we can see, and the effects are devastating and reason enough for us to wish to stick our heads in the sand and just not look at it, or perhaps cease to have to deal with it, however that would look. But many of the effects of our sin, many of the effects of our not being in line with God's will, our inability to be in line with God's will, that has such a cumulative effect in the lives of others, which we are not even aware of. So if we don't take seriously the fact of our being in big trouble regarding our own goodness, then we're not honest. We're not honest with ourselves, and we're not honest to God, to use the English expression.
Exactly. And maybe on that point, you can read the next thesis while I plug in my laptop.
Okay, perfect. A great tag teaming here. Yes, on the point of on the previous point of being deserving. Thesis 20 reads, he deserves to be called a theologian, however, who comprehends the visible and manifest things of God seen through suffering and the cross. Now, here, 19, we've got the theology of glory, more of a natural theology, trying to provide for ourselves a system by which we can join in God's gracious act of saving us. And then in thesis 20, though, we are given nothing else than the cross and pointed to it, saying that forget the things you think you know about God and all the grand, elaborate systems that you have contrived regarding him and his work, and look at how he has, how does Paul put it, revealed himself in fullness through the death, suffering, death, and ultimately resurrection of Christ on the cross. But I think that is really a point which needs to be stopped at a little bit and further elaborated upon. What is this? What does God show us there in his suffering on the cross? You look enthusiastic to jump in on that point.
I was almost suffering there.
Warum so?
I almost got shocked by my own charger.
We would have called it divine intervention.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, sorry, I'm back. Where were you now?
Well, on thesis 20, that he deserves to be called a theologian who comprehends the visible and manifest things of God seen through suffering and the cross.
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, I think a theologian of glory would today look at the optimistic side of life, or like try and be optimistic about life, see where God is doing wonderful things, and where, you know, we can look at maybe a person of faith and say, wow, that person is such an example for us. That's all very good and sometimes necessary. But I think, yeah, when it's said that a theologian can be called a theologian because he looks through suffering and the cross at God's manifest and visible things, when we hear that, then I think of how in the really tough times when you don't really know where you are going, or you have a terrible illness, or you're losing people in your life, these are times when it's not that easy to say that things are clear and we can just look at the bright side of life. It's actually more, we can then look at the cross, and we can then look at the more unexplainable things. And one of those things, I think, is how God even still works in our suffering when we can't quite explain it. Yeah.
You put it so well, I'm tempted to not want to elaborate on it, but given my talkative nature, I unavoidably will. Tristan, indeed, I think that seeing the things of God through suffering and the cross allows us to honestly account for our own slip-ups and for the effects thereof in this world. Both of ourselves and of others. We can look at suffering, both suffering that comes from within and suffering that comes from without, in light of Christ's suffering. There, I think very much God has made, how could one say, I don't want to use the word made allowance for, but there he has truly embraced the grand mess that we tend to make of life. And there, through his work on that cross, he's given us a way in which to be all right at the end of the day, in which to be all right, even though we very much aren't, and even though we very much cannot be, and even though the effects of our sin and others really leads to terrible things in this life, which we have to deal with and live through. And I think no man, no person can truly be a theologian if not accounting for that, for the hard reality of our brokenness and the effect it has on our lives and others and this world.
Yeah, and I must say, as someone who's now working in a congregation as an intern pastor, I see the very heavy meaning of this. The idea that, you know, people are really broken. I notice that. And now that I do some more work and have deeper conversations with people, I also realize we all have problems and we all have these thorns in our back, like Paul says it, that we have to deal with. And especially things like uncertainty and you know, money issues, or yeah, so many things can actually really afflict us. And a theologian of the cross, I think, looks at this and says it as it is sometimes.
Yes.
And what it is really is sometimes terrible suffering that we can't quite make sense of. And it's okay also to be not okay.
That's a good way to put it. Yes. It's okay to not be okay. And it's okay to look at our life and to realize that we have very many problems to which there very often aren't solutions. And that's a very difficult thing to have to acknowledge sometimes. But what we do have, and I think this is what theology of the cross strives at, is we do have evermore the cross. We do have Christ very, very much back then, way back then, taking all upon his shoulders and bearing it, and still loving us despite everything else. You know, at the end of the day, to still have the cross, despite our problems, despite our sufferings, despite our sin, that is, I think, the true comfort of the theologian.
Exactly. And that's why we, of course, have the cross in the middle at the front.
Yes.
You know, the pulpit on the side and the cross in the middle in the Lutheran church.
Very much so. And that's obviously where this beautiful painting by Cranach comes from. This is one half of the painting. It's from an altarpiece in, I believe it's in, well, it's probably in a church to which you will be rather close in Germany. So please do travel there and take for us a nice photo, a selfie.
Yeah.
Luther, in his lectures upon the Psalms, from where Paul also had this quote from Romans, makes the bold statement that crux sola est nostra theologia. The cross alone is our theology. And this painting then beautifully, I think, summarizes what you've just verbally depicted, Tristan, is that the job of the theologian, the job of the preacher, is Sunday after Sunday to stand upon that pulpit and point to the center point of our Christian faith, namely Christ upon the cross. And the place of the laity, who are just as much theologians as the preacher, is to look to the cross and to cling this in the midst of all of the realities of life, to cling not to the cool ideas and beautiful words and abilities of the pastor or the preacher or this personality or that personality, but to Christ.
Yeah.
When all else falls away or seems to be what it is, namely unable to support the weight of our lives, then we still have the cross, and thank God that is enough.
Thank God, yes, indeed. Thank you for the gift, we can say.
Thank you for the gift, indeed, yes.
And on that note, I think we almost have to end because
I think so too. Perhaps then, just with the quote, do you have the theses before you?
Yes.
I think it would be eminently appropriate if you end this this presentation of ours on the Heidelberg Disputation by reading thesis 25 and 26 as by summary.
All right. He is not righteous who does much, but he who without work believes much in Christ. This is thesis 25 and then thesis 26. The law says, do this, and it is never done. Grace says, believe in this, and everything is already done. And that
Amen.
is our comfort. Yeah.
Indeed it is. Okay. Thank you, Tristan.
Yeah. Thank you too. And I hope our listeners got something from this, at least a little bit of comfort as well, which I'm sure P and I often also need.
Most definitely.
Like, comment, and subscribe.
And keep well. Cheers.
Bye-bye.